Thank you very much for your talk, David, and your book. We're seeing a lot of growth, particularly in plant-based businesses, meat alternatives, dairy alternatives, massive growth. We're also seeing large companies, meat companies such as Tyson buying shares in plant-based companies. We're seeing Danone, big dairy companies buying these vegan and plant-based businesses. My question to you is, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on how that's going to impact our food economies and animal welfare?
In the United States, we used to subsidize tobacco. And when the decision was made to end those subsidies, Congress put in place measures to transition tobacco farmers to new crops, among other things, wine grapes. And so now there are many former tobacco farmers who are growing wine grapes. I would like to see the elimination of subsidies coupled with transition programs so that factory farmers can now raise or produce plant-based foods. There's no reason they can't raise soy, or given the factories, import soy from someplace and produce plant-based foods. I think the Tyson example is a great one. As much as I hate to support a huge multinational big ag company like that, the idea that they're doing that shows that that is probably the way. I think we'll see animal agriculture gradually move to more of a plant-based system over time, because they recognize that that's the future.
On ag-gag, you referred a couple of times to the United States Constitution and the protection of the right of free speech, and you were quite optimistic in some of your remarks about the future of some of those cases. We don't have a constitution like that. We have some implied rights of political discourse and the like, and I wondered if you'd been able to form any view of the Australian equivalent as whether we're more exposed to ag-gag legislation than you are in the United States.
It's definitely the case that your right of free speech is not quite as broad as ours in the United States. And so I think that it's not quite as clear that ag-gag laws in that first category are as subject to challenge here. On the other hand, there is some case law to suggest involving a possum factory farm that conditions on factory farms are matters of politics, and that is one of the areas where free speech is protected. So there is some cause for optimism. I wouldn't bet the farm on this, no pun intended, but there is some cause for optimism that as these cases get litigated, and it hasn't happened yet, that your right of free speech might be found to overcome an ag-gag law.
Going back in time a little ways, when the export industry was attacked and everything was trying to be stopped, the meat industry went crazy to outlaw anything that Animals Australia or anyone else could do about that. So on your basis, and I love your idea of the meat tax, but on that basis and seeing it's the government that has to instigate that, what hope would we have of actually that happening when the meat industry has such a huge influence over the government?
70 years ago, Chesterfield Cigarettes used to promote its cigarettes in magazine ads that said, 9 out of 10 doctors smoke Chesterfields. And I think, not to disparage the medical profession, I think we're at a state right now with respect to animal foods that tobacco was in 70 years ago. And that is to say, once the medical profession recognizes that it's possible to treat diseases like cancer, diabetes, and heart disease by changing diets, the influence of the medical profession will lead to policymakers taking steps such as we saw with taxation of tobacco. And by the way, it took a long time before judges would rule against tobacco companies as well. Everybody who makes these decisions is a human being, and it's subject to all of their biases and cultural histories and everything. But I think it's going to take the medical profession to lead us into this new policymaking arena. And when that happens, I think we'll see things like meat taxes. We might see warning labels on meat the way we do with cigarettes. That's sort of the progression that I see. I think we'll see it most likely in a smaller, more progressive country like Denmark or Sweden, or possibly even in a progressive state like California, for starters.
I understand that the number of, or the amount of antibiotics fed to animals is greater than fed to humans. Is there a part that the drug companies are also involved in this whole activity to increase their profits?
Yes, I don't know if anyone's heard of the movie What the Health that has just come out. There were flyers distributed in Adelaide where we did our last talk. It's a great movie, and it talks about the influence of profits that drive things like pharmaceutical manufacturers, medical professionals, and others, and that lead to decisions about animal foods. For example, the American Cancer Society is interviewed in this movie, and the director basically says that there's no link between meat and cancer. Economics are driving these policy decisions that, for example, pharmaceutical companies, medical professionals, and medical community makes with respect to animal food. So yes, it's challenging to overcome. There's a lot of money at stake, and they have influence over legislators and members of parliament. And yes, so that is a legitimate concern.
Hi, what's your view on cultured meat grown in laboratories, and how that might save us all from all of this?
Well, I think cultured meat, first of all, is very expensive today, but the projection is that, like all technology, it will be inexpensive someday. I think it will represent a good transition protein for people who might not be willing to give up meat entirely, but who become aware of some of the ethical, environmental, and other issues surrounding animal food production. So I think it's a good thing. Personally, I don't know that I would eat it myself, but that doesn't mean it's not a good idea for others.
How does the pet food industry fit into all this?
Well, foods fed to companion animals are often sort of the remnants of what results at the abattoir, and it's often rendered. So to some extent, it's the parts of the animal that people aren't eating. How does it fit in? Well, dogs don't need to eat meat, for example. They're not obligate carnivores. And for example, dogs could go through the same personal transition that we talked about with humans and would likely be healthier as a result. I don't know. Didn't really look at that as part of the book. So, yeah.
I'd like to ask a question about the research you've done into externalized costs. How did you do a dollar comparison between things like health costs and suffering? How do you put a dollar value on the suffering? And the reason I ask is because I'm looking at doing similar research in Australia.
In my pie chart, there's a cost associated with cruelty in the US of about $20 billion. And that's derived from a study that a couple of agricultural economists did in the last 10 years, in which they ran actual live auctions where people were invited to spend their own money, real dollars that came out of their own wallets, on the proposition of moving animals from inhumane environments like sow stalls and battery cages to humane environments, areas where there's more space, they're not closely confined. Based on what people were actually willing to spend, like pull out their wallet and actually spend, it's possible to extrapolate data across a wider universe. Economists recognize this concept of willingness to pay as a potential externalized cost. So what that number is a willingness to pay figure for what Americans are likely to be willing to pay to improve factory farm conditions for animals.
I might just add a point on that topic. When talking about externalities in terms of animal suffering, the report that I referred to before from the Productivity Commission had a really incredible finding in that it said there's a negative externality because animal welfare is a public good, And so it causes concern or discomfort for members of the community who find our treatment of farmed animals not to be appropriate. And that in itself generates a negative psychological externality, which wasn't included in these calculations, but it's quite remarkable that a government body produced material with that conclusion.
Given the increasing consumption of meat in China, do you have any thoughts about what's going to happen with that economy and the increase in factory farming in that part of the world? And given also that we export a lot of our meat to Asia.
I think China is facing the same issues that the US and Australia have, which is that the levels of consumption will be unsustainably high. At some point, every industrialized economy reaches the point where animals, because of the levels of consumption, animals can only be raised in factory farms. For example, in the United States, it is not possible to return to a system of raising animals on land where their manure goes to the land and it helps increase the land's health and productivity. There simply is not enough land in the country. And I think China is going to face that same problem because it's got many more people than we do. These levels of consumption simply are not sustainable.
Back in the 90s, Paul Keating was talking about the J-curve and that things were going to get worse before they got better. So do you think we're currently at the stage of they're going to get worse in this sphere before they get better? It seems like you are quite optimistic overall, but how far do you think things are going to go before we see improvements?
I think there's cause for optimism, and I also think there's cause for pessimism. I think we're in a battle. For example, in the US, we've just had laws successfully passed in a couple of states that support welfare and better conditions for farm animals. And at the same time, Arkansas has just passed a new ag-gag law. We're seeing, in some categories, a decline in meat consumption. In fact, the slide that I show of chicken consumption, which ends at 2014, if you were to extend that a bit, you would actually see that flatten out. So that trajectory is not indicative of how it goes into future years. It does flatten out. People are actually consuming less animal foods, not just for price reasons, but for other cultural reasons, and not the least of which I think is some people are just deciding that they want to switch to a plant-based diet or eat less meat. So on the one hand, yes, I'm optimistic. On the other hand, producers have huge amounts at stake. In the US, it's a $251 billion industry, so they're not going to go gently. They're going to continue to push their interests.
In terms of optimism in Australia, we were recently found to be the nation with the highest number of searches for the term vegan in Google. So it's a sign that the movement is growing. So that concludes our evening. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking David.